John Vavassur de Quintin Jones was very fond of throwing stones at horses, people, passing trains, but specially at window panes. Like many of the upper class, he liked the sound of broken glass. It bucked him up and made him gay. It was his favourite form of play. But the amusement cost him dear, my children, as you now shall hear. John Vavassur de Quintin had an uncle who adored the lad, and often chuckled, "Wait until you see what's left you in my will." Nor were the words without import, because this uncle did a sort of something in the city which had made him fabulously rich, although his brother, John's papa, was poor as many fathers are. He had a lot of stocks and shares and half a street in Buenos Aires, but this pronunciation varies. Some people call it Buenos Aires. A bank in Rio and a line of steamers to the Argentine, and options more than I can tell, and bits of Canada as well. He even had a mortgage on the house inhabited by John. His will, the cause of all the fuss, was carefully indited thus: "This is the last and solemn will of Uncle William, known as Bill. I do bequeath, devise, and give, by execution mandative, the whole amount of what I've got. It comes to a tremendous lot. In season to devolve upon my well-beloved nephew John, and here the witnesses will sign their names upon the dotted line." Such was the legal instrument expressing Uncle Bill's intent. As time went on, declining health transmogrified this man of wealth, and it was excellently clear that Uncle Bill's demise was near. At last his sole idea of fun was sitting snoozling in the sun. So once when he would take the air, they wheeled him in his patent chair. By they, I mean his nurse, who came from Dorchester upon the Tame. Miss Charming was the nurse's name. To where, beside a little wood, a long-abandoned greenhouse stood, and there he sank into a doze of senile and inept repose. But not for long his drowsy ease. A stone came whizzing through the trees, and caught him smartly in the eye. He woke with an appalling cry, and shrieked in agonizing tones, "Oh, Lord, whoever's throwing stones?" Miss Charming, who was standing near, said, "That was Master John, I fear." "Go get my ink-pot and my quill, my blotter and my famous will." Miss Charming flew as though on wings to fetch these necessary things, and Uncle William ran his pen through well-beloved John, and then proceeded in the place of same to substitute Miss Charming's name, who now resides in Portman Square, and is accepted everywhere. There was a boy whose name was Jim. His friends were very good to him. They gave him tea and cakes and jam and slices of delicious ham and chocolate with pink inside and little tricycles to ride, and read him stories through and through, and even took him to the zoo. But there it was the dreadful fate befell him, which I now relate. You know, at least you ought to know, for I have often told you so, that children never are allowed to leave their nurses in a crowd. Now this was Jim's especial foible. He ran away when he was able, and on this inauspicious day he slipped his hand and ran away. He hadn't gone a yard when, bang! With open jaws a lion sprang, and hungrily began to eat the boy, beginning at his feet. Now, just imagine how it feels when first your toes and then your heels, and then by gradual degrees your shins and ankles, calves and knees are slowly eaten bit by bit. No wonder Jim detested it. No wonder that he shouted, "Hi!" The honest keeper heard his cry. Though very fat, he almost ran to help the little gentleman. "Ponto," he ordered as he came, for Ponto was the lion's name. "Ponto," he cried with angry frown. "Let go, sir. Down, sir. Put it down." The lion made a sudden stop. He let the dainty morsel drop and slunk reluctant to his cage, snarling with disappointed rage. But when he bent him over Jim, the honest keeper's eyes were dim. The lion having reached his head, the miserable boy was dead. When nurse informed his parents, they were more concerned than I can say. His mother, as she dried her eyes, said, Well, it gives me no surprise. He would not do as he was told. His father, who was self-controlled, bade all the children round attend to James's miserable end, and always keep a hold of nurse, for fear of finding something worse. Henry King, who chewed bits of string and was early cut off in dreadful agonies. The chief defect of Henry King was chewing little bits of string. At last he swallowed some which tied itself in ugly knots inside. Physicians of the utmost fame were called at once, but when they came they answered as they took their fees, "There is no cure for this disease. Henry will very soon be dead." His parents stood about his bed, lamenting his untimely death, when Henry, with his latest breath, cried, "Oh, my friends, be warned by me, that breakfast, dinner, lunch, and tea are all the human frame requires." With that the wretched child expires. Godolphin Horne was nobly born. He held the human race in scorn, and lived with all his sisters where his father lived, in Berkeley Square. And oh, the lad was deathly proud. He never shook your hand or bowed, but merely smirked and nodded. Thus. How perfectly ridiculous. Alas, that such affected tricks should flourish in a child of 6, for such was young Godolphin's age. Just then the court required a page, whereat the Lord High Chamberlain, the kindest and the best of men, he went good-naturedly and took a perfectly enormous book called People Qualified to be Attendant on His Majesty, and murmured as he scanned the list, to see that no one should be missed, "There's William Coots has got the flu, and Billy Higgs would never do, and Guy de Vere is far too young, and wasn't Dalton's father hung, and as for Alexander Byng, I think I know the kind of thing. A churchman, cleanly, nobly born. Come, let us say Godolphin Horne." But hardly had he said the word when murmurs of dissent were heard. The King of Iceland's eldest son said, "Thank you, I am taking none." The aged Duchess of Athlone remarked in her sub-acid tone, "I doubt if he is what we need." With which the bishops all agreed, and even Lady Mary Flood, so kind and oh so really good, said, "No, he wouldn't do at all. He'd make us feel a lot too small." The Chamberlain said, Well, no doubt you're right. One cannot tell." He took his gold and diamond pen and scratched Godolphin out again. So now Godolphin is the boy who blacks the boots at the Savoy. Matilda told such dreadful lies it made one gasp and stretch one's eyes. Her aunt, who from her earliest youth had kept a strict regard for truth, attempted to believe Matilda. The effort very nearly killed her, and would have done so had not she discovered this infirmity. For once, towards the close of day, Matilda, growing tired of play, and finding she was left alone, went tiptoe to the telephone, and summoned the immediate aid of London's noble fire brigade. Within an hour the gallant band were pouring in on every hand, from Putney, Hackneyed Downs, and Bow. With courage high and hearts aglow, they galloped roaring through the town, "Matilda's house is burning down!" Inspired by British cheers and loud proceeding from the frenzied crowd, they ran their ladders through a score of windows on the ballroom floor, and took peculiar pains to souse the pictures up and down the house, until Matilda's aunt succeeded in showing them they were not needed, and even then she had to pay to get the men to go away. It happened that a few weeks later her aunt was off to the theatre to see that interesting play, The Second Mrs. Tanqueray. She had refused to take her niece to hear this entertaining piece, a deprivation just and wise to punish her for telling lies. That night a fire did break out. You should have heard Matilda shout. You should have heard her scream and bawl, and throw the window up and call to people passing in the street, the rapidly increasing heat encouraging her to obtain their confidence, but all in vain, for every time she shouted, "Fire!" they only answered, "Little liar," and therefore when her aunt returned, Matilda and the house were burned. Young Algernon, the doctor's son, was playing with a loaded gun. He pointed it towards his sister, aimed very carefully, but missed her. His father, who was standing near, the loud explosion chanced to hear, and reprimanded Algernon for playing with a loaded gun. Lord Lundy, from his earliest years, was far too freely moved to tears. For instance, if his mother said, "Lundy, it's time to go to bed," he bellowed like a little Turk. Or if his father, Lord Dunkirk, said, "Hey," in a commanding tone, "Hey, Lundy, leave the cat alone," Lord Lundy, letting go its tail, would raise so terrible a wail as moved his grandpapa the Duke to utter the severe rebuke, "When I, sir, was a little boy, an animal was not a toy." His father's elder sister, who was married to a parvenu, confided to her husband, "Drat the miserable peevish brat, why don't they drown the little beast?" Suggestions which, to say the least, are not what we expect to hear from daughters of an English peer. His grandmamma, his mother's mother, who had some dignity or other, the Garter, no matter what, I can't remember all the lot, said, "Oh, that I were brisk and spry to give him that for which to cry." An empty wish, alas, for she was blind and nearly 93. The dear old butler thought, but there I really neither know nor care for what the dear old butler thought. In my opinion, butlers ought to know their place, and not to play the old retainer night and day. I'm getting tired, and so are you. Let's cut the poem into two. Lord Lundy's second canto. It happened to Lord Lundy then, as happens to so many men, towards the age of 26 they shoved him into politics, in which profession he commanded the income that his rank demanded in turn as Secretary for India, the Colonies, and War. But very soon his friends began to doubt if he were quite the man. Thus, if a member rose to say, as members do from day to day, "Arising out of that reply," Lord Lundy would begin to cry. A hint at harmless little jobs would shake him with convulsive sobs, while as for revelations, these would simply bring him to his knees and leave him whimpering like a child. It drove his colleagues raving wild. They let him sink from post to post, from 1,500 at the most to 8 and barely 6, and then to be curator of Big Ben. And finally there came a threat to oust him from the cabinet. The Duke, his aged grandsire, bore the shame till he could bear no more. He rallied his declining powers, summoned the youth to Brackley Towers, and bitterly addressed him thus: "Sir, you have disappointed us. We had intended you to be the next Prime Minister but 3. The stocks were sold, the press was squared, the middle class was quite prepared. But as it is, my language fails. Go out and govern New South Wales." The aged patriot groaned and died, and gracious, how Lord Lundy cried. George, who played with a dangerous toy and suffered a catastrophe of considerable dimensions. When George's grandmamma was told that George had been as good as gold, she promised in the afternoon to buy him an immense balloon. And so she did. But when it came, it got into the candle flame, and being of a dangerous sort, exploded with a loud report. The lights went out, the windows broke, the room was filled with reeking smoke, and in the darkness shrieks and yells were mingled with electric bells, and falling masonry, and groans, and crunching as of broken bones, and dreadful shrieks, when worst of all the house itself began to fall. It tottered, shuddering to and fro, then crashed into the street below, which happened to be Savile Row. When help arrived, among the dead were Cousin Mary, little Fred, the footman, both of them, the groom, the man that cleaned the billiard-room, the chaplain, and the still-room maid, and I am dreadfully afraid that Monsieur Champignon, the chef, will now be permanently deaf, and both his aides are much the same, while George, who was in part to blame, received, you will regret to hear, a nasty lump behind the ear. The moral is that little boys should not be given dangerous toys. Mariah, who made faces and a deplorable marriage. Mariah loved to pull a face, and no such commonplace grimace as you or I or anyone might make at grandmamma for fun, but one where nose and mouth and all were screwed into a kind of ball. the which, as you may well expect, produced a horrible effect on those it was directed at. One morning she was struck like that. Her features took their final mould in shapes that made your blood run cold and wholly lost their former charm. Mamma, in agonized alarm, consulted a renowned masseuse, an old and valued friend of hers, who rubbed the wretched child for days in 25 different ways, and after that began again. But all in vain. The years advance. Mariah grows into a blooming English rose, with every talent, every grace, save in this trifle of the face. She sang, recited, laughed, and played at all that an accomplished maid should play, with skill to be of note, golf, the piano, and the goat. She talked in French till all was blue, and knew a little German, too. She told the tales that soldiers tell. She also danced extremely well. Her wit was pointed, loud, and raw. She shone at laying down the law. She drank liqueurs instead of tea. Her verse was admirably free and quoted in the latest books, but people couldn't stand her looks. Her parents had, with thoughtful care, proclaimed her genius everywhere, nor quite concealed a wealth which sounds enormous, £30 million, and further whispered it that she could deal with it exclusively. They did not hide her chief defect, but what with birth and intellect and breeding and such ample means, and still in her delightful teens, a girl like our Mariah, they thought, should make the kind of match she ought. Those who had seen her here at home might hesitate, but Paris, Rome, the foreigners should take the bait. And so they did. At any rate, the greatest men of every land arrived in shoals to seek her hand. Grand dukes, commanders of the fleece, mysterious millionaires from Greece, and exiled kings in large amounts, ambassadors and papal counts, and rastaqueres from Palomares, and famous foreign secretaries. They came along in turns to call, but all, without exception, all, though with determination set, yet when they actually met, would start convulsively as though they had received a sudden blow, and mumbling a discreet "good day," would shuffle, turn, and slink away. The upshot of it was Mariah was married to a neighbouring squire, who, being blind, could never guess his wife's appalling ugliness. The man was independent, dull, offensive, poor, and masterful. It was a very dreadful thing. Now let us turn to Sarah Byng. Some years ago you heard me sing my doubts on Alexander Byng. His sister Sarah now inspires my jaded muse, my failing fires. Of Sarah Byng the tale is told how when the child was 12 years old she could not read or write a line. Her sister Jane, though barely 9, could spout the catechism through, and parts of Matthew Arnold too, while little Bill, who came between, was quite unnaturally keen on Athalie by Jean Racine. But not so Sarah, not so Sal. She was a most uncultured gal, who didn't care a pinch of snuff for any literary stuff, and gave the classics all amiss. Observe the consequence of this. As she was walking home one day, upon the fields across her way, a gate, securely padlocked, stood, and by its side a piece of wood on which was painted plain and full, "Beware the very furious bull." Alas, the young illiterate went blindly forward to her fate, and ignorantly climbed the gate. Now, happily the bull that day was rather in the mood for play than goring people through and through, as bulls so very often do. He tossed her lightly with his horns into a prickly hedge of thorns, and stood by laughing while she strode and pushed and struggled to the road. The lesson was not lost upon the child, who since has always gone a long way round to keep away from signs, whatever they may say, and leaves a padlocked gate alone. Moreover, she has wisely grown confirmed in her instinctive guess that literature breeds distress. The nicest child I ever knew was Charles Augustus Fortescue. He never lost his cap, or tore his stockings, or his pinafore. In eating bread he made no crumbs. He was extremely fond of sums, to which, however, he preferred the parsing of a Latin word. He sought, when it was in his power, for information twice an hour, And as for finding mutton fat unappetizing, far from that. He often at his father's board would beg them of his own accord to give him, if they did not mind, the greasiest morsels they could find. His later years did not belie the promise of his infancy. In public life he always tried to take a judgment broad and wide. In private none was more than he renowned for quiet courtesy. He rose at once in his career, and long before his 40th year had wedded Fifi, only child of Bunyan, first Lord Aberfield. He thus became immensely rich and built the splendid mansion which is called the Cedars, Muswell Hill, where he resides in affluence still, to show what everybody might become by simply doing right. Jack had a little pony, Tom. He frequently would take it from the stable where it used to stand and give it sugar with his hand. He also gave it oats and hay and carrots 20 times a day, and grass in basketfuls, and greens, and swedes, and mangolds, also beans, and patent foods from various sources, and bread, which isn't good for horses, and chocolate, and apple rings, and lots of other things, the most of which do not agree with polo ponies such as he, and all in such a quantity as ruined his digestion wholly, and turned him from a polo pony, into a case that clearly must be seen to, because he swelled and swelled and swelled, which when the kindly boy beheld, he gave him medicine by the pail, and malted milk, and nutmeg ale, and yet it only swelled the more, until its stomach touched the floor, and then it heaved and groaned as well, and staggered, till at last it fell and found it could not rise again. Jack wept and prayed, but all in vain. The pony died, and as it died, kicked him severely in the side. Moral: kindness to animals should be attuned to their brutality. Tom and his pony Jack. Tom had a little pony Jack. He vaulted lightly on its back, and galloped off for miles and miles, a-leaping hedges, gates, and stiles, and shouting, "Yoicks!" and "Tally-ho!" and "Heads I win!" and "Tails below!" and many another sporting phrase. He rode like this for several days, until the pony, feeling tired, collapsed, looked heavenward, and expired. His father made a fearful row. He said, "By gum, you've done it now. Here lies a carcass on the ground, no less than 25 pounds. Indeed, the value of the beast would probably have much increased. His teeth were false, and all were told that he was only 4 years old. Oh, curse it all! I tell you plain, I'll never let you ride again." Moral: his father died when he was 20, and left 3 horses, which is plenty. John Henderson, an unbeliever, had lately lost his joie de vivre from reading far too many books. He went about with gloomy looks. Despair inhabited his breast, and made the man a perfect pest. Not so his sister, Mary Lunn. She had a whacking lot of fun. Though unbelieving as a beast, she didn't worry in the least, but drank as hard as she was able, and sang and danced upon the table. And when she met her brother Jack, she used to smack him on the back so smartly as to make him jump and cry, "What-ho, you've got the hump!" a phrase which more than any other was gall and wormwood to her brother. For having an agnostic mind, he was exceedingly refined. The Christians, a declining band, would point with monitory hand to Henderson, his desperation, to Mary Lunn, her dissipation, and often mutter, "Mark my words, something will happen to those birds." Which came to pass, for Mary Lunn died suddenly at 91, of psittacosis, not before becoming an appalling bore, while Henderson, I'm glad to state, though naturally celibate, married an intellectual wife who made him lead the higher life, and wouldn't give him any wine, whereby he fell in a decline, and at the time of writing this is suffering from paralysis, the which we hear with no surprise will shortly end in his demise. The moral is, it is indeed, you mustn't monkey with the creed. The rich arrived in pairs, and also in Rolls-Royces. They talked of their affairs in loud and strident voices. The husbands and the wives of this select society lead independent lives of infinite variety. The poor arrived in Fords, whose features they resembled. They laughed to see so many lords and ladies all assembled. The people in between looked underdone and harassed, and out of place and mean, and horribly embarrassed. For the hoary social curse gets hoarier and hoarier, and it stinks a trifle worse than in the days of Queen Victoria, when they married and gave in marriage, they danced at the county ball, and some of them kept a carriage, and the flood destroyed them all.